I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to Reading Rousseau's Social Contract. Today, we're continuing where we left off, which last time we saw each other, we finished book one. Now we're going to be looking at book two, chapters 1 through 5. And I hope it's not going to be that long. I think it's going to be maybe my structuring of this. Maybe I should break it up chapter by chapter, but we'll see about this. Now, again, if we go back to if I went here, let me see if I can get. No, I'm not going to be able to do that. Damn it. If we go back to the. Okay, discuss book two deals again. The subtitle is discussing legislation. Right. So let's get on with it. Chapter one. That sovereignty is invisible. Now, inalienable. In other words, sovereignty itself is inalienable. Now, this is again following the logic that Rousseau in the first book gives us the state as the social contract and the idea of state as a contract, following Hobbes and Locke in a great degree. And there's people say, well, Hobbes and Rousseau, no, Locke and Rousseau are like the opposites. No, they're not. They appear that way. The more you closer to read Rousseau, the more he finds ultimately comes in agreement with Locke, and that what we think as the things are different are mostly tones of rhetoric and not necessarily the substantive differences. Rousseau's tone tends to be more kind of the style of Rousseau, and the approach is kind of deceiving in that sense. It assumes as a critique, but then also implies arguments inside of it, as we will watch. So, chapter one, sovereignty is inalienable. I mean, it's something that cannot be transferred, cannot be subsumed. Now, the first and most important consequence of the principle established above, and that was the creation of the general will, right, is that the general will alone can guide the forces of the state according to the end for which they were instituted, which is the common good, right? For if again, the purpose of this is the common good, a good that is shared, right? For if the opposition of private interests made the establishment of societies necessary, right? The idea that in other words, that these competition between the opposition of interest made the establishment of societies necessary, the social contract, right? It is the agreement of these same interests that made it possible. This is, in other words, the idea if the private interests in conflict with each other in the state of nature lead us to the creation of society to form peace and to establish common good, a shared common benefit, right? It is it is what these different interests have in common that forms the social bond. And if there were not some point at which all the interests were in agreement, no society could exist. Right? Now, it is uniquely on the basis of this common interest that society ought to be governed. So, therefore, the things that we hold in common, the things that his argument is governed, that society is based on a shared set of interests and shared set of things that we share in common, the common, right? And therefore, government should follow what is common, not as what is different. I say, therefore, that sovereignty, being only the exercise of the general will, can never be alienated, and the sovereign, which is only a collective being. Now, this is a difference between our Rousseau makes it clear that the sovereign is a collective being, only a collective being. In that sense, the people, the large. Hobbes is a little less. Hobbes can say Hobbes plays this. It can be one, few, or many. Wink, 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 wink. Right. Hobbes is a little more kind of like, again, because he's writing at time and to an audience that is more favorable to monarchy, particularly in England. The English model, the English example, is more favorable to monarchy, and he doesn't want to be seen, that get clearly dismissed by, many of the I mean, even the point of Cromwell's understanding was that Cromwell's the Parliament without some kind of sovereign entity for governing things, Parliament fails, right? And I think Starkey is right that Cromwell is all a monarch, the crown regent or the regent, right? Is a king in all but title. He needs must be in that sense otherwise everything collapses in that sense. And I think Starkey is right in this sense, and therefore this is the. I think we need to understand why Hobbes does use the rhetoric of a personhood, of a monarch, sovereign being a person. That this is his attempt to kind of persuade the English audience that he's. There's two audiences, and there's the English Leviathan, and then there's the Latin Leviathan. And even then, there is still kind of an attempt to persuade this to monarchs, right? To persuade monarchs to enjoy this, following Houdon's attempt to get monarchs to embrace the concept of sovereignty, right? So let's continue here. So therefore, that never can be alienated, and that the sovereign, who is a collective, can only be represented by itself. So this idea that the sovereign is only the collective will, the collective body in that sense. Power can perfectly well be transferred, but not will. So power, what is power here? Power is the ability to act, to do things, the ability to act, the ability to do something, the ability to move, the ability to carry out something, to compel, to force, to do, right? This can be transferred. Power can be transferred, but not will. Will cannot be transferred. My will, in other words, therefore, the will of the collective. This is the big difference. I think this is a difference in this. That I think in Hobbes, will seems to be transferable to the individuals, whoever the sovereign is, one, few, or many. That the individual will is transferable. This is why Rousseau seems not to allow a transfer. Rousseau only understands the sovereign as the collective and can only be the collective because will cannot be transferred. Now, that's a very important thing because if will cannot be transferred, then there's no collective will, and therefore there's no sense as a unitary collective will. Rather, the general will is just merely the will of all those individuals collectively in Rousseau, not as an aggregate, not as a unitary construct, which many writers hate. This is maybe the big difference. Rousseau's ambiguity about this point, how he seems to suggest this, will lead to those assuming that it's a homogeneity. But from what he says here, it cannot be. Power may be transferred to a unitary structure, but not will. The will still remains in the aggregate members who form this, and therefore that's why it's the general will. Right? It's not, and that sovereignty is understand that way. Okay, this is a very. I think this is a way to understand this. Indeed, though it is not impossible for a private will to agree with the general will on a given point, it is impossible, at least, for this agreement to be lasting and unchanging. For the private will tends to be, by its nature, towards preferences, and the general will towards equality. In other words, the general will simply just be everything that's in common, and therefore, what holds them in common is that all the wills together, and what holds them in common will be kind of something they share, and therefore they will be equal. But the Pacific will may not be. It might be in conflict. And in terms of what is common, I mean, the ordering preference, that what holds us together may not be first order, second, it may be second and third order preferences of the individual parts. But that's enough that they all see this as a common thing of equality. They hold it together, they share it equally. Whereas the individual will private ends. That will the private end in that sense. So this is, I think, this is where the confusion will start to begin. This is the ambiguity in Rousseau because of his language, and his not precision here. I think this is the problem. The ambiguity of language starts altering what he's trying to say. in that sense. His original conception of this, right? Um, it is even more impossible for there to be a guarantee of this agreement, even should it always exist, right? Therefore, there's no agreement, no guarantee that the individual and the collective are always going to agree. There can be a situation that they will have different interests in that, right? It would not be the result of art, but of chance. So this is interesting. It's not of an art, not of a craft or some kind of thing. That this it is even more impossible for that there to be a guarantee of this agreement that should always exist, right? So therefore, it's not by that it's not going to be an art to make sure that there's this agreement, but rather by chance, right? By chance. The sovereign may well say, I certainly want that a particular man wants, or at least he says he wants. But it cannot say, I want that man, I want that man will want tomorrow, I shall still want. Okay? In other words, this is the big difference. The sovereign may well say, I currently want what a particular man wants, or at least what he says he wants. Right? This sovereign can say this, right? But it cannot say, this is an interesting point, but it cannot say, I want that man tomorrow. So the idea is that it cannot, the will of the sovereign can't, it can say, I want what that person wants now in the present. It cannot make a promise for that individual or aspect of that individual in the future, since it is absurd for the will to tie itself down for the future, and since no will can consist to anything that is contrary to the good of the being that wills. So therefore, since everything is the collection of, every will is the will, and therefore the idea is a person is free, and therefore every free will is a decision in that sense of that I'm able to make my decision, and I cannot be bound by the future. Whoa, whoa, whoa. This is, again, I think this is a big difference, again, between Hobbes and Rousseau in this sense. Hobbes and Locke says that once you make an agreement, you are the agreement here, and that we made a decision, you are bound by it. Your will is bound by it. Here, Rousseau says that free will is still free, and that yes, we're to some degree we've bound ourselves to this, but there's the actors in here are still wills, and that their wills, although bounded by a set of agreements, they are still free ultimately. And this is the question of deciding what the individual wants in relation. Now, the argument, can the will want not to be bound by the original bond to the agreement? That's a question. Right? That's something I think we have to address and maybe have to think about. Maybe that's a contradiction in these things. So, but no one can will anything contrary to anything that is contrary to the good of the being that wills. So there's this idea that it has to be good for that person. Therefore, the idea that society is good. Therefore, he was not going to will something that will lead him to the destruction. That would be irrational. That would be an improper act of will in that sense, right? No sane person. The argument here would be a rational person would do this, right? Therefore, if the people promise simply to obey, it dissolves itself by the act. It loses the status of a people. So, in other words, here the people promises to simply obey. They're not. The moment there is a master, there is no longer a sovereign, and from then on, the body politic is destroyed. So, it's not a question of obedience. He's saying that if all the will says I'm going to simply obey, in the Hobbesian sense, right? Obedience. That I've agreed to this and I'm going to obey. Then there's no longer a body politic. It's destroyed. There's no longer a sovereign. There is a master and there's no longer a sovereign. It's very interesting. Mastery and sovereignty are not synonymous concepts in Rousseau. This is not to say that the command of leaders cannot pass for expressions of the general will, as long as the sovereign, being free to oppose them, does not do so. Okay, this is where Mr. I see. You've watched our video talking about Kojève's thing. This is where Kojève gets his idea. The idea that this is in Rousseau is that you have the free that authority comes from. There's the agreeing to something, but having this possibility to say no. He's free to say no, but he chooses to. This act of choosing does not. Therefore, there can be commands of leaders, cannot pass from expression of the general. This is not. Doesn't mean it's not saying that commands of leaders are not expressions of the general will, right? Not an aspect of sovereignty. But because why? It's because they agree. The sovereign agrees to it. The sovereign has agreed to it. They, being free to oppose them, they do not do so. In such a case, one ought to presume the consent of the people from universal silence, tacit consent. Again, this is where you get a stronger argument. The silence of a people is consent. I say no. If you say no or oppose, then that's an obsolete no. I object. But if you either, I can say yes, but I can also say silent. Silence is consent in Rousseau in that sense. Woo. We get a lot of trouble with that one. This will be explained at greater length. Two, that sovereignty is indivisible. For the same reason as sovereignty is inalienable, it is indivisible. Because either the will is general or it's not general. In order for the will to be general, it is not always necessary for it to be unanimous. That's a great interesting point. It does not mean general means unanimous. It means that there's it's basically you take all the wills and what do they have in common? What do they share in common? What are the norm, right? The norm in that sense, the things they have in common. The wills, what most of them, this is like an opinion survey, right? What they want, and there's going to be a bunch that is going to have the most things they have in common. If it's going to be a community that works, right? Um, is not it's not going to be unanimous, but it is necessary that all votes be counted. Any formal exclusion destroys this generality. So there can be no exclusion of those who are in the community. In other words, if you exclude some people from this and don't count them, you count everyone. This is the idea. This is how the general will. Again, the general will is the collective will in that sense, not a unitary construction, not a unanimous construction. So it's very interesting in that point. It is the will of the people as a body, or of only a part. It is the will of a body or of a part. In the first case, this declared will is an act of the sovereign and constitutes war. In the second case, it's merely a private will or an act of a magistrate, and it's at most a decree. Now, this is a distinction between a law and a decree. Ooh. I think this Schmidt would come in, a law and a decree. Well, a law is it is a decree is a part acting on behalf of the whole. A law is an act, it is, because it's still a private will, or an act of a magistrate. Okay, so it's either a private will, in other words, a will of a part, declared will, and act. If it's a declared will, in the first case, that it's will of the people is either as a body, the collective part, or only of a part. If it's of the body, it's a declared will is an act of the sovereignty of the sovereign, right? And constitutes law. A law constitutes a law. I think it should be, but it constitutes law. Law. Schmidt would be aha. This is what I talked about legality and legitimacy. And the second criteria is this is the difference between law and decree. A law represents the general will, the thing of the commonality. A decree is, if it's going to be two things. It's going to be if an entity, a part that has been authorized to act on behalf of the sovereign is exercising this. And that is that. Whereas a private will by its own is just my own thing. But if it's an act of the magistrate, it is at most a decree. If it's a private will, it it is an act of I want something. It's not a decree in that sense, but it's. I think this that he needs to distinguish. I think this is a little place where he needs to clearly make that distinction. But this idea, but for our political theorists, unable to divide the principle of sovereignty, divide it in its objects. They divide it into forces and wills, into legislative power and executive power, into rights of taxation, justice, and war, into internal administration and power to negotiate with foreigners. Now, this is interesting. The idea they divide it. They start dividing the distinction. And I can see what his point here is that no, the will itself isn't divided. It's that is carrying out. And what these functionalities, these applications of force, or this application of doing, that's the difference between will. There's a distinction here, divides it into force and will. The legislative power, the executive power, right, into rights of taxation, justice, and war, right. Sometimes they mix all of these parts together. Sometimes they separate them. They turn the sovereign into a fantastic body formed of bits and pieces. It is as if though they constructed a man out of several bodies. No, this is idea. One of which would have eyes, the other arms, and other feet, and nothing more. Japanese charlatans have said to cut up a child right in front of the audience. Then, tossing all the parts into the air one after another, they make the child come back down alive in one piece. The juggling act of our political theorists are about like that. After they have taken the body apart by a trick worthy of a carnival, they put the pieces back together in some unknown way. Now, I think this is a critique. This sounds like a massive critique of Montesquieu and the separation of powers, right? And I think maybe David Stark, you should perhaps read this in the French and see that Rousseau agrees with you, David, here. And I think this is it's worthy to pay attention to this. I still think I think there's something on here. And I think that's a difference between his sovereignty cannot be divided. And to argue that what Montesquieu is doing regarding this division of powers is a division of sovereignty, that's a misunderstanding of Montesquieu. But that this misunderstanding of Montesquieu might be common, particularly those who want to use Montesquieu to argue for the so-called mixed constitution that's earlier. There is this mixed constitution where there's this idea of the different parts of things. There's the king, the aristocrats, and the people, right? This medieval mixed constitution, which echoes a division of powers theory. Again, Montesquieu speaks of a division of powers, the power of the entity, not the sovereignty of the entity. This is interesting. I would argue that Montesquieu is kind of quiet on sovereignty. He's, it's more about power in that sense. And I think this is where there is this, I think, but I think, in many sense, Rousseau was taking aim here more at the mixed constitutionalists, medieval, post-early, even the modern Reformation, but the early moderns who adapted modern theory to mixed constitutionalism as a kind of response here, right? This era comes not of having developed precise concepts of sovereign authority, and for having mistaken the parts of that authority, what were merely emanations from it. Okay, this idea that the emanations of that common authority, the bodies, the institutions. The legislator is a body. In other words, the legislature is in other words, in other words, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial are emanations of sovereignty. They don't make sovereignty; they come from the sovereign. In that sense, right? They're, they mistake the parts of that authority that were merely emanations from it. Thus, for example, acts of declaring war and making peace have been regarded as acts of sovereignty, which they are not. So, in other words, this is this idea that making war is no, which they are not, since each of these acts is not a law, but merely an application of the law, a particular act which determines the legal situation, as will be clearly seen when the idea attached to the word law is established. So I'll go back up there. Remember his point? His point here is that declarations of war and things like that are not necessarily law in this fundamental sense. And this is what's interesting. Um, they are rather decisions applied through law. So, well, that would mean that the idea that the Constitution formally grants the Congress the power to declare war, but not to declare peace in that sense. That's really weird. That only to declare war. The implication is by implication there, but then the fact that the president is the commander in chief and has all war powers vested in him in that weird entity, that article, the Article 1, Article 2 incoherence in the American Constitution doesn't give sovereign to president sovereign power. This is the mistake. This would be a mistake in Rousseau's view. That no, the parts only exercise what the Constitution says. Both are not sovereigns. They are only agents of a sovereign. They're representatives of the sovereign. They have their power from the sovereign, the people. As the law is the Constitution itself. The Constitution is the fundamental law which defines their magisterial power in that sense, their magisterial power to make a decision. By examining each other in the same way, it would be found that every time it is thought that a sovereign is divided, a mistake has been made, and that the rights that are mistaken for part of that sovereignty are always subordinated to it, and always presuppose supreme wills which these rights merely execute. Okay, this idea between the execution of something, that therefore it is that therefore the people who are not exercising sovereignty but executing what a will has, as the sovereign has decreed, and therefore there's a mistake of this idea here. Okay, it is hard to overestimate how much of this lack of precision has obscured the decision of those who have written on the subject of political right when they wanted to judge the respective rights of kings and people on the basis of the principles they established. Right. This is taking part at Grotius. Right. In chapter 3 and chapter 4 of the first book of Grotius, anyone can see how this learned man and his translator Barbara got entangled and trapped in their sophisms, for fear of saying too much or not enough according to their viewpoints, and for offending the interest they need to reconcile. Grotius, taking refuge in France, discontent with his homeland and wanting to pay court to Louis XIII, to whom his book is dedicated, spares nothing to divest the people of all their rights and endow kings with them as artificially as possible. This would certainly have been the preference of Barbrek, too, who dedicated his translation to George I of England. But unfortunately, the expulsion of James II, which he calls abdication, forces him to be cautious, evasive, and equivocal, not to make William appear to be an usurper. If these two writers had adopted the true principles, all their difficulties would have been avoided, and they would have always been consistent. So, in other words, Grotius and the translator Beribak. barbaric. And that's very interesting. The barbaric translation is very good, but it also is playing around trying to make sure not to call usurper, where this is the problem, right? For in truth, for truth does not lead to fortune, and and the people do not confer embassies, professorships, and pensions. The very interesting thing: the people do not give us embassies, professorships, and pensions. Kings do, executives do. So therefore, the truth, um, uh, uh, but but they would have told the truth with regret and paid court only to the people, right? But the truth does not lead to fortune, and people do not have embassies, professorships, and things. So therefore, again, this is their interests. Now, Rousseau is kind of poking fun at them, saying, "Of course, they didn't tell the truth because they if they told it, if they praised the people as the real source of power, people don't have doesn't give them fortune, won't give them fortune, and won't give them professorships and these things, right? Embassies." Now, chapter 3: whatever the general, whether the general will can err, can the general will make mistake? From the foregoing, it follows that the general will is always right and always tends towards the public utility. So the general will is always right and tends, but it does not allow that the people's deliberations have always the same rectitude. So again, so in other words, the general will is always going to care for that, but the deliberations of people, the public deliberations, do not will cannot follow that they will have the same rectitude. General will is always right, and it always cares for the common public utility. But the deliberations of the people themselves may not. One may want what is good for oneself, but one does not always see it. Right? They don't always see it. They don't always see that. The people is never corrupted, but it is often fooled, and only then does it appear to want what is bad. So it's not corrupt. In other words, he doesn't. Now this is Rousseau's. The people aren't corrupted. They just are fooled in this sense, because they don't they see something that is bad for them, but they think it's presented as something good. And only then does it appear they want something bad. They don't want something bad. They just been fooled, misled in that sense, right? There is often a great difference between the will of all and the general will. Okay, that's the big interesting. There's a difference between the will of all. The latter consists only in the common interest. The former consists in the private interest, right? So the latter is the general will. This is common interest, what we share in common. In the norm, this is all the things we have in common, the point that holds us together. The common interest, the general will, is that will that is common. That is the common, the will that of the interest, the things that hold us together. The will of all is always the private interest. He's saying, right? What I want, what I want, what I want. The former consists in private interest and is only the sum of private wills. So the will of all is the sum of private wills. But take away from these same wills the pulses and minuses that cancel each other out, and the remaining sum of the difference is the general will. Now, this is each interest, says Marquis d'Argesson, has different principles. The agreement of two private interests is formed in opposition to the interest of a third. He could have added that the agreement of all interests is formed in opposition to the interest of each. If there were no if there were no different interests, the common interest would never be encountered any obstacle, or would scarcely be felt. Everything would run smoothly by itself, and politics would never cease to be an art, right? So this is that. This is the problem here, is that there's a difference of this. But then he says, okay, but take away from these same wills the pluses and minuses that cancel each other out. Right? This is where the general will, things that have in common. The remaining sums of the differences is the general will. So that the will of all. No, these are the private interests. This is an aggregation of private interests. But if you look carefully and you do the sums and minuses of each of the private interests, he says canceling out the same will, the plus and minus that cancel each other out. Right? Again, he says here that this is the way this is going. The remaining sums is this is a passage that is confusing, and I think it's contradictory to a little degree. I wish he said that. I wish he expanded this and think of this. So let's see what continues. If, when an adequate informed people deliberates, the citizens were to have no communication among themselves, the general will always result from the large number of small differences, and the deliberation would always be good. But when factions and partial associations at the expense of the whole are formed, the will of each of these associations become general with reference to its members, and particularly with reference to the state. One can say then that there are no longer any voters as there are men, but mainly as many as there were associations. Right. So therefore, this is an interesting point. That general will always result in a large number of small differences. Right. Um, Repeat, if, when an adequate and informed public deliberates, the citizens were to have no communications among themselves, the general will would always result from the large number of small differences, right? And the deliberations would always be good, but they have communications among themselves. But when factions, because they have communication, partial associations at the expense of the whole are formed. Okay, factions are what? Partial associations at the expense of the whole are formed. The will of each of these associations become general with reference to its members, in particular with reference to the state. So therefore, they're general among their members, those who are in the faction, but it's a particular will in reference to the state. One can say then that there are no longer as many voters as there were men, but merely as many as their associations. So therefore, what happens is that these groups are like this, and now that becomes really one, and that therefore instead of everyone like this, but rather a different associate, all these wills like this, right? These associations. The difference becomes less numerous, and produce a result that is less general. So therefore, the idea that once if you have a larger thing where every individual, you'll get a general thing. But because of this, it becomes less. Because of these associations through private communications, uh, 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 you get these factions. These factions become associations, and that they're general. The people who are within that faction faction becomes general amongst the members within that thing, but in relation to the whole, it's particular. And then what happens instead of all the individuals, you have not all these individual voters, but all these associations, and this creates a problem. He says, right? The differences become less numerous and produce a result that is less general. Finally, when one of these associations is so big that it prevails over the other, the result is no longer a sum of small differences, but a single difference. Then there is no longer a general will, and the opinion that prevails is merely a private opinion. So therefore, this idea of this is the emergence of the rise of a powerful will that is able to become so large, and no longer it does this, right? Um, in order for the general will to be expressed, It is therefore important that there be no partial society in the state. Okay. And each citizen gives only his own opinion. Again, this is a quote from the Book of Florence, Machiavelli's Book of Florence, right? History of Florence. On it's in Italian. You can go look at the thing there. I'm not going to go read it from the group. It's his own opinion, right? The idea that if they have the groups. Now, the argument here is that therefore there can be no intermediate associations. Whoa. So you need to destroy anything that association that creates bonds or societies, micro societies within the thing. There can be no intermediate. This is where Rousseau, I can see now, this is a Tocqueville will say, no, Jean-Jacques, you've gone, once you've done this, what you want is this idea. His argument is he wants to prevent private wills, that this becoming merely a one private will imposing upon over another private will, but rather always present the general will. And the only way you can do that is by not allowing partial societies and every citizen to give his vote. But this is the contradiction in this problem. Once you do that, you have to destroy all the intermediating institutions. Ew. So this is the contradiction in our. He wants this. He wants to preserve this against factions, because the faction rise to merely the destruction of the common good. But okay, now I see Federalist 10 here. I see Madison in Federalist 10 struggling with this, because this isn't, in many ways, isn't what he's trying to argue here, destroying of all those private associations, ultimately destroying the freedom, like trying to, that idea in Montesquieu. Okay, that's interesting. Such was the unique and sublime system instituted by the great Lycurgus. Well, wait a minute. Sparta. Whoa. But Lycurgus' solution is to enslave another people. The helots, right? They create a common, this is Sparta, right? This is Sparta. Lycurgus is the founder of Sparta. Sparta is a good example. Is this really a collection of general will in this sense? Aristotle would critique Sparta very heavily on this and argue that no, you still get your problem. You can't. In other words, the problem of the private will is unescapable. There's no solution out of it. Aristotle's critique of Sparta. If Rousseau's answer is Sparta, Aristotle's response to Rousseau is, no, you're not going to get out of it. The thing you want of this perfect general will is this always going to be confronted by the problems of private wills. And how, you're going to always have this. And this is why this idea of, once you have the idea of everything has to be voluntary, consensual, you get this problem here. You get this irresolvable problem here. The question is, can the common good, the common benefit? Now, Rousseau at one level suggests that people need to be forced to be free, but does this mean destroying the private options? Okay. If there are private partial societies, their number must be multiplied and their inequality prevented, as was done by Solon, Numa, and Severus. These precautions are the only valid means of ensuring that the general will is always enlightened and that the people is not deceived. So, okay, this is Solon. Now, he talks about Lycurgus, but then he goes Solon. Solon does it by what? By the creating of democratic Numa, religion. And Severus, that's an interesting one. Severus isn't. Okay, I'm going to do something that I normally don't want to do. I want to look at a footnote. It's going to drive me crazy. I'm sorry. Maybe I should stop after this, but Okay. Dun, 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 dun. Okay. I apologize. I should have stopped for now. It's 46. Okay. This criticism of partial societies that have often been cited in the introduction of Rousseau's hostility to pluralist democracy and political practice. Some even speak of totalitarianism in this regard, Watkins and Vaughan. But in reading this passage, one must take into account Rousseau's definition of partial society as a group of within a corporate will. See the group theory politics spelled out in the economy, pages 112, 113. As discussed in the introduction, pages 21, 23. The right to vote in secret without others watching how the ballot is marked is based on the reasoning like that of Rousseau's, expecting private parties in expecting partial societies in every community. Rousseau's principles are particularly opposed to a single party system and oriented towards a multiplicity of groups and parties, none of which claims to rule in his own name. Note that while Sparta was unique and sublime, it was Rome whose laws were formed on numer and were revised by Severus, which Rousseau calls the best government ever existed. In the letters of criticism of Montaigne, 7, right? Chapter 7 or book 7. Indeed, in a fragment comparing Sparta to Rome, in this the letters of to Montaigne, right? Um, Rousseau remarks that the founders of both republics established many electoral divisions, colleges, and private societies in order to create and excite the citizens between those sweet habits and innocence and disinterested comments which form and nourish passions. This is the parallel between Sparta and Rome, and fragment 2 of the Palid, book 3, right? So okay, I can see that. This is what Masters kind of points to. I think that is a good point, that has to be understood in this larger term. I think this is the problem with Rousseau. You have to read Rousseau very carefully, because if you take it very superficially, you would misunderstand the crux of what he's trying to say. Okay. I'm going to stop here. I'm just going to stop here. I think this is going to be have to be. I'm going to have to rearrange numbers, because there's no way I can do this. It will be too long. So, okay, we're going to stop here. If you have any comments, questions, or issues you want to talk about, please put them below here. Otherwise, we will. I will respond to them when I see them. If you like it, like it. Like the button, hit the like button, share it, put it on social media, send it with your friends. If you've not subscribed, subscribe. Encourage others to subscribe. Other things you can do. Okay, if you didn't like it, you had a problem, or you didn't like something, well, you can hit the down button, but say why in the comments and put your criticism there. So maybe I can learn something from it. Another thing is, if you want to follow me on social media, the links are below. You can see my academic social media links there listed below there. And if you want to help and become a patron or assist, be a patron, donate some money to help me do what I do every week, a month, things. You can do so by through Patreon or Subscribestar. The links are below. I think this is gonna, you like. I wish there could be two one-off monies, but we'll see what happens. The other thing is that you can help me by buying one of my books listed below, um, and links below, like that. We'll see each other next time. This is we'll continue chapter 4 of this. Um, Take care. Have a good day. Bye bye.